Consider this your final lesson. They say when the knife finally hits your back, it's never from a stranger. It's from someone you taught how to hold it. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. My name is Madison Carter, and at exactly 7:59 a.m., I lost everything I thought I had worked for. My title, my reputation, my place in a company I helped build from the ground up. Gone in a single sentence. Consider this your final lesson, sneered Ethan Caldwell, the CEO's nephew, as he leaned against the glass wall of my office, sipping his oat milk latte like it was a victory toast. He didn't even let me finish my coffee. He handed me a beige envelope, my termination letter, and smiled like he was doing me a favor. Effective immediately, it said. No severance. No warning. Just a polite reminder that loyalty means nothing when nepotism walks through the door. I stared at him, speechless. I'd given 7 years of my life to Caldwell Dynamics, a tech firm that had grown from a scrappy startup to a Fortune 500 darling. I'd led teams through chaos, secured deals that kept the lights on, and practically ran operations while the CEO, Richard Caldwell, traveled the world, managing investors. And now his smug, silver spoon nephew, who couldn't even spell logistics 2 months ago, was firing me. Don't take it personally, Ethan said, straightening his designer jacket. Uncle Richard just thinks it's time for new blood. He paused, grinning wider. And maybe fewer women in the boardroom. You know how old school he can be. Something in me snapped. But I didn't show it. Not yet. I smiled, slow, calm, measured. Of course, I said softly. Every empire needs its purge. He frowned, clearly not understanding what I meant. And I didn't bother explaining. Because while Ethan was busy preening in the reflection of my office window, I was already running through the clauses of the founder's agreement in my head, a document I knew better than anyone because I had written half of it myself. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he handed me that termination letter, he pulled the trigger on something that had been sleeping quietly for years, the founder's reversion clause. It was meant as a safeguard, a legal landmine buried deep in the company's bylaws, a clause that would only activate under very specific conditions. If at any point a founding officer is removed without cause, all proprietary control and intellectual rights revert to the founding equity pool. In simple terms, fire me without cause and every product, patent, and process tied to my name reverts back to me. And since every major system the company relied on bore my signature, the supply chain model, the client management software, the production algorithms, firing me had just handed me the detonator. But Ethan didn't know that. Richard Caldwell didn't either. Because arrogance makes you blind. I walked out that morning with my head held high. I didn't slam the door, didn't yell, didn't even look back. The HR assistant looked guilty as she handed me a box for my things. My team stood frozen in silence, their eyes following me as if I were walking to my own funeral. But I wasn't. I was walking to their reckoning. At 8:47 a.m., I deposited my final paycheck. At 9:10, I met with Laura Chen, my lawyer, the only person who knew the full extent of what I had built into Caldwell Dynamics Foundation. By 9:52 a.m., a courier was already on his way to the boardroom. When the envelope landed in front of Richard Caldwell, he probably thought it was another complaint from investors. But when he opened it and read the first line, he went pale. He passed it to the lawyer beside him, who read it twice, then whispered something that made the entire room fall silent. Richard's hands trembled as he turned to Ethan. And in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "You triggered the founder's reversion clause." That was the moment the empire began to crumble. They thought they could humiliate me, discard me, erase me. But they forgot one thing. I built their castle from the ground up. And I made sure I held the blueprints. This isn't a story about losing a job. It's about what happens when you teach the wrong people power, and they forget who taught them. My name is Madison Carter, and this is the story of how I made them regret ever underestimating me. When you spend years building a company from scratch, you don't just know its strengths. You know its weaknesses, every crack, every secret, every vulnerability no one else sees. And that morning, As I sat in the corner booth of a small coffee shop in downtown Chicago, sipping bitter espresso and staring out at the street, I realized I was finally free to use that knowledge. For years, I'd been the quiet architect behind Caldwell Dynamics' success. The one who stayed late after board meetings to fix what others broke. The one who patched up numbers, rewrote investor reports, and covered Richard Caldwell's reckless financial adjustments. He called me his right hand. But really, I'd been his shadow. The one who kept his empire from collapsing under the weight of his ego. And now, his own arrogance had set me loose. Laura, my lawyer, slid into the booth across from me. She was calm, efficient, a woman who understood that revenge, when done right, is never emotional. It's procedural. "You're sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, flipping open a file. "This isn't just a warning shot, Madison. Once I file this notice, the entire company's structure reverts to your co-founder rights. It'll cause chaos." I smiled. "Good. Let's give them chaos." Laura arched a brow. "And you're not worried they'll come after you legally?" "They can try," I said, tapping the file. "Everything they've built rests on systems with my proprietary code. Once the reversion triggers, their operations freeze. The supply chain halts. The automation servers go dark. And their investors start calling within the hour." She leaned back, a slow grin spreading across her face. "You really did think of everything." I nodded. Ethan thought firing me was a power move. But he just handed me the detonator. By noon, the notice was filed. By 1 p.m., it was sitting in the inbox of Caldwell's general counsel, marked urgent, legal notification of founder's clause activation. Meanwhile, I went home, not to sulk, not to cry, but to prepare. I opened my laptop, logged into my secure network, and began rerouting access protocols. Every system I designed had a silent override key, a master switch that only I could control. It wasn't about sabotage. It was about protection. I'd learned early in my career that trust without leverage is suicide. As the day wore on, messages started popping up. First from ex-colleagues. "Madison, what's going on?" "The production servers just went offline." Then from suppliers. "Payments are bouncing. Did the company freeze transactions?" And finally, from Ethan himself. "Ethan Caldwell, you think this is funny? You're messing with a multi-million-dollar operation." No, Ethan. "I'm reclaiming what's legally mine." 5 minutes later, Richard called. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Madison," he began, his voice all honey and panic. "I think there's been a misunderstanding."
"No misunderstanding, Richard."
"You've violated the agreement." "Come on," he said, trying to sound calm. "Let's be adults about this. We can find a settlement." I let out a short laugh. "You mean the kind of settlement where you keep everything I built and I walk away quietly?" "Madison, listen." "No, you listen," I interrupted. "You let your nephew fire me without cause. That activated the clause. Legally, every proprietary element tied to my work reverts to me. You can't run your systems without me, Richard. You can't ship products, track inventory, or even bill clients. You turned off the woman who held the power switch." There was a pause. Then, for the first time in 7 years, Richard Caldwell didn't sound like a CEO. He sounded like a man realizing he'd lost control. "Please," he said quietly.
"Come in."
"Let's talk." "I'll think about it," I replied and hung up. But I had no intention of going back, not yet. I wanted him to feel the weight of every ignored email, every stolen idea, every late night I spent fixing his mistakes. I wanted him to watch the company unravel, thread by thread. By evening, the chaos had hit the news cycle. Tech blogs were already reporting that Caldwell Dynamics' main servers had gone offline due to an internal legal dispute. Their stock dropped 18% in one day. Investors were panicking. And while the corporate world scrambled for answers, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine and my laptop, watching the storm I'd unleashed. I didn't feel guilt. I felt peace. For years, I'd been invisible. The woman behind the curtain, cleaning up after men who mistook luck for leadership. But now, the curtain was gone. And for the first time, I was visible, not as an assistant, not as an executive, but as the rightful architect of the empire they'd tried to steal. I knew this was only the beginning. Ethan would panic. Richard would beg. Lawyers would scramble. But none of them could stop what was already in motion. Because when you build something with your own hands, you know exactly how to take it apart. And I was just getting started. By the next morning, the fallout had reached full detonation. The financial press called it the fastest corporate shutdown in tech history. Caldwell Dynamics stock had plunged another 32%. Clients were freezing contracts. Suppliers demanded answers. And the funniest part? No one inside the company seemed to understand why everything was failing. I didn't take joy in their panic, not at first. For 7 years, Caldwell Dynamics had been like a second home. Those people weren't just co-workers. They were friends, mentors, the interns I'd helped rise through the ranks. But then I'd remember the look on Ethan's face when he said, "Consider this your final lesson." And my pity turned to purpose. At 9 a.m. sharp, Laura called. "They've filed for an emergency injunction," she said. "They're trying to argue that your clause was invalidated by structural changes in 2021. I smirked. Good luck proving that. I personally oversaw those changes. The clause was never touched. Exactly, Laura replied. Their lawyers are panicking. But, Madison, this is escalating fast. They're pulling favors, calling regulators, leaking statements to the press. I expected that, I said, sipping my coffee. They're fighting shadows. Every piece of this company runs through my systems. The longer they resist, the more they lose. Still, I knew there was one wild card, Ethan. He was arrogant, impulsive, but also vindictive. He wouldn't just sit and take it. By afternoon, my prediction came true. A black SUV parked outside my apartment. 2 men in suits stepped out, Caldwell's legal consultants. They handed me a document, a cease and desist order accusing me of corporate sabotage. I signed the delivery receipt with a calm smile. Then, before closing the door, I said, "Tell Ethan I appreciate the paperwork. He's finally learning what a real contract looks like." That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights dim, laptop glowing. I watched the live feed of a private shareholder meeting, one of the few systems I still had silent access to. Richard Caldwell looked 20 years older. His tie hung loose, his hair disheveled. Across the table, Ethan was pacing, red-faced and sweating. "This is insane," Ethan shouted. "She's bluffing. Just reboot the servers." "It's not that simple," Richard snapped. "She locked proprietary systems under her credentials. If we force access, we risk erasing everything." "So pay her," Ethan yelled. "Buy her out." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "We can't. The clause gives her legal ownership of the core technology. She doesn't need us, we need her." For a moment, silence. Then one of the board members leaned forward and said what no one else dared to. "Maybe you shouldn't have fired her." Ethan's face turned pale. I should have felt triumphant watching that, but instead, an unexpected feeling crept in, guilt. Not for them, but for the innocent people caught in the middle, the engineers, analysts, and assistants now scared for their jobs. They didn't deserve this fallout. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. Revenge feels clean when you dream it. But in reality, it leaves ash on everything. Still, I couldn't stop now. I was too far in, and so were they. At midnight, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Unknown. Meet me tomorrow. 10 a.m. Pier 47. It's about Ethan. I didn't recognize the number, but curiosity got the better of me. The next morning I went. The air was cold, mist curling off Lake Michigan. A woman in a navy coat stood waiting, one of Caldwell's senior accountants, Dana Reyes. I remembered her from old budget meetings. Smart, loyal, honest. "Madison," she said quickly, glancing around. "You need to know something." "What is it?" "It's Ethan," she whispered. "He's trying to transfer company funds offshore, millions. He's blaming you for the shutdown and planning to use it as cover to move money out before the board discovers." My blood ran cold. "He's stealing from a company?" "Exactly. He's hoping when it all collapses, they'll pin everything on you. claim you sabotaged the company and caused the financial damage. I clenched my jaw. It was classic Ethan. Cowardly.
Dirty.
Predictable. Dana handed me a flash drive. Here's proof. Transaction records, timestamps, everything. I can't keep it. If they find out, I'm done. I took it and nodded. You did the right thing. I'll handle this. That night, I opened the files, and sure enough, Ethan had been draining accounts for days.
Million gun.
He was setting me up as the scapegoat. But he made one fatal mistake. The transfers were processed through systems I designed, and every keystroke left a traceable digital fingerprint. I smiled. Got you, Ethan. The next morning, I sent an anonymous packet to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crimes Division. Every file, every timestamp, every name. By evening, agents were walking through Caldwell Dynamics glass doors. Ethan's victory was about to turn into a criminal investigation. I watched the footage on the news. Ethan being escorted out of the building, shouting that it wasn't his fault, that I'd set him up. Maybe I had. Or maybe he'd set himself up the moment he decided to underestimate me. But the chaos wasn't over yet. Because in the background of that broadcast, I saw Richard Caldwell, standing still, staring at the cameras, his face hollow, defeated. And for the first time, I wondered, would I stop once I destroyed him too? The air in Chicago that week felt heavier than usual, thick with smoke from construction and the scent of rain on asphalt. But inside Caldwell Dynamics, the storm was not outside. It was inside the glass towers, inside every office, every boardroom, every heartbeat of the people who had underestimated me. By Tuesday morning, the FBI had taken over operations. Ethan Caldwell was in custody, flanked by agents who looked as disappointed as they were firm. The press cameras swarmed, broadcasting live, the so-called golden boy of tech being let out in handcuffs while the company crumbled around him. Richard Caldwell, pale and disheveled, tried to command the boardroom. Everyone listen. This is a misunderstanding. Madison, she's.
His voice faltered.
No one listened. No one cared. Because in that moment, it wasn't just Ethan who had failed. It was the system he'd inherited, one built on arrogance, nepotism, and blind trust in the wrong people. I sat in my apartment, laptop open, watching the chaos unfold in real time. Every server I had keyed under my control continued to operate under my oversight, but now with a twist. Certain functions were frozen. Production, shipping, billing, all frozen. The executives scrambling inside those skyscrapers were not just helpless. They were at my mercy. Then came the calls. First, lawyers from the board, frantic, polite, begging. Second, investors, shouting, panicking, demanding answers. Third, Richard himself, voice breaking, pleading, whispering my name like a prayer. I answered only once, calmly. Richard, you have two options. You can try to rebuild, which will require my cooperation, or you can watch the empire collapse around you. Your choice. There was a long silence. Then, finally, he whispered, I don't know if I can trust you. I smiled. Trust isn't the issue. Respect is. You lost both the moment you let Ethan fire me. By noon, I had complete control of Caldwell Dynamics operational systems. Emails, client portals, financial software, everything that mattered was tied to my credentials. One misstep, one attempt to bypass me, and the company would grind to a halt permanently. And yet a small voice inside me asked, how far is too far? I had envisioned this revenge for months, meticulously planned, legally bulletproof, devastatingly precise. But watching Richard Caldwell, the man I had once admired for his genius, but now despised for his arrogance, I felt a strange pang. Could I take it all? All the power, all the systems, all the glory? Before I could answer, a notification pinged. Dana Reyes again, the accountant. Dana, Madison, there's another complication. Some of the offshore accounts Ethan used, they were mixed with Richard's personal funds. If the feds trace it, he could go down too. He's at risk. I stared at the screen. I had a choice. Let Richard drown alongside Ethan, or save him while keeping my position secure. I thought back to that morning when I'd left Caldwell Dynamics after being fired. The anger had been pure, righteous, deserved. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Innocent people would pay if I let the entire empire burn. I made a decision. By 3 p.m., I restored access to critical systems, just enough to stabilize the company, save employees' jobs, and prevent catastrophic losses. I left Ethan's accounts frozen, fully documented for federal seizure. I left Richard humbled, scared, and fully aware of how close he had come to losing everything. Then came the final act. I sent a letter to the board. Effective immediately, I reclaim my rights as co-founder and operational overseer. I will assist in stabilizing the company, but I retain all proprietary ownership of the systems I created. Any attempt to bypass, manipulate, or challenge this clause legally will be met with full enforcement. Consider this your final lesson. It was poetic, precise,
Perfect.
Richard Caldwell called me immediately, voice shaking. Madison, thank you.
I
don't know how to repay you.
You don't repay, I said. You respect.
And you remember why loyalty and competence matter. By the end of the day, the story had gone viral. COO fires back, founder's clause halts multi-million-dollar company, headlines screamed. Social media lit up with analysts dissecting every move. Investors were impressed with my legal and operational genius. And Ethan, well, the FBI ensured he wouldn't be celebrating anytime soon. I leaned back, finally allowing myself a smile. It wasn't just revenge. It was justice. It was strategy. It was a reminder that underestimating someone with knowledge, skill, and patience is a dangerous gamble. And for the first time in years, I felt the pure, exhilarating power of control. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had risen above them. I wasn't just Madison Carter, the COO who got fired. I was Madison Carter, the architect who had the foresight to plan 10 steps ahead and the courage to see it through. The empire trembled. The villains faced consequences. And I walked away with my integrity intact, my mind sharp, and my victory complete. Revenge, I realized, isn't about hatred. It's about reclaiming what's rightfully yours, with style, precision, and patience. And now, the final lesson had been delivered. By the time the dust settled, Caldwell Dynamics had transformed, not entirely, but enough for the world to take notice. The boardroom was no longer dominated by arrogance and nepotism. Richard Caldwell, humbled and wary, had learned a painful lesson about loyalty, competence, and underestimating the people around him.
Ethan? Gone.
His career and freedom were both in jeopardy, and no amount of charm or entitlement could save him. I, Madison Carter, had emerged not only unscathed but elevated. Not through revenge alone, but through strategy, patience, and foresight. It wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about rubbing their faces in the chaos I could have created. It was about balance. About restoring justice in a world where my expertise had been exploited, my loyalty undervalued, and my ambition mocked. In the weeks that followed, I focused on stabilization. The engineers, analysts, and assistants who had once looked to me for guidance were now cautiously optimistic. I helped restructure teams, improve workflow, and ensure that Caldwell Dynamics' reputation, while tarnished, could recover. I'd given them a second chance, not because they deserved it, but because I could. And somewhere deep down, it felt good to wield that power responsibly. I realized that revenge, when guided by intelligence and ethics, is more than punishment. It's transformation. Richard, surprisingly, reached out one morning. Madison, he said, voice shaky. I want to thank you. I see now what I ignored for years. You taught me a lesson I won't forget. I hope we can work together going forward. I considered his words carefully. I could have demanded equity, authority, even complete control. But I chose restraint. Because the strongest power is the power not abused. Richard, I replied finally, respect and recognition are worth more than fear. Remember this. Underestimate no one. And never assume loyalty comes cheap. He nodded, humbled. And for the first time in years, I felt peace. Outside the boardrooms and courtrooms, my life returned to quiet reflection. I spent evenings walking along Lake Michigan, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, from the fired executive, betrayed and underestimated, to the woman who had reclaimed her agency and set a precedent no one could ignore. Friends who had watched from the sidelines began reaching out. They marveled at the story that had gone viral, the one where a woman had flipped the corporate world on its head without breaking a single law. I laughed quietly when they asked, "Wasn't it scary?" It had been. Scary, exhilarating, exhausting. But more importantly, it had been worth it. I realized the lesson wasn't just for Richard or Ethan. It was for anyone who had ever been undervalued, overlooked, or betrayed. Knowledge is power. Patience is strategy. And revenge, when executed with precision and integrity, is a lesson everyone remembers. Months later, Caldwell Dynamics began to stabilize. The company's systems were stronger, more transparent and safer, a lasting testament to the work I had done and the foresight I had always held. And me? I didn't just rebuild a career. I rebuilt my identity. No longer the quiet architect behind the scenes, I had emerged as a force, calm, decisive, and unafraid. Some nights, I still replay that morning in my head, 7:59 a.m., the moment Ethan smirked and handed me a termination letter. I smile then too, because I know exactly how close they came to destroying everything and how beautifully I turned it around. Justice, I've learned, isn't about vengeance for its own sake. It's about reclaiming power that was wrongly taken. It's about turning betrayal into strategy, chaos into clarity, and fear into respect. And in that, I found a new freedom. I am Madison Carter. And this was my final lesson to them. Never underestimate the person you tried to discard. Because the very moment you do, you may just hand them the keys to your kingdom. The empire trembled. They were humbled. And I finally soared. Thanks for watching. If you loved Madison's story and want to see more jaw-dropping revenge tales, make sure to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Comment below and tell us what you would have done in her shoes. We love reading your thoughts.